Welcome to Historical Legacies. Here, we dive into history's most intriguing stories, unraveling mysteries and uncovering truths from the past. Subscribe to join our journey through time's greatest moments. Nicholas II, the Tsar who lost Russia. Nicholas II, the last emperor of Russia, was a ruler bound by tradition, yet trapped in an era of relentless change. Ascending the throne in 1894, he inherited a vast empire at the brink of turmoil, where social unrest, political upheaval, and economic instability brewed beneath a fragile monarchy. His reign was marked by a desperate struggle to uphold an autocracy that had long begun to crack, even as revolutionaries, reformists, and war relentlessly pulled Russia toward an uncertain future. From the opulence of the imperial court to the blood-soaked battlefields of World War I, Nicholas's decisions, whether driven by duty, faith, or tragic misjudgment, reshaped Russia and sealed his own fate. Was he a ruler overwhelmed by forces beyond his control, or did his failure to adapt doom the empire he swore to protect? As the Bolsheviks closed in, the Romanov dynasty crumbled, leaving behind a legacy of both reverence and resentment. This is the gripping story of Nicholas II, the Tsar who lost Russia. Part 1. A Crowned Destiny, the young Tsar's unprepared ascent. Nicholas Alexandrovich Romanov was never meant to inherit an empire under such circumstances. Born in 1868, he grew up in the shadow of his formidable father, Tsar Alexander III, a ruler known for his iron will and firm grip on the empire. As the eldest son, Nicholas was always the heir, but no one, including Nicholas himself, expected him to take the throne so soon. His father was a towering figure, physically strong and politically dominant, ruling with absolute authority. He believed in autocracy as Russia's only path forward, and yet, he did little to prepare his son for the immense burden of ruling such a vast and complex empire. Nicholas's education was rigorous in history, languages, and military training, but it lacked the hands-on governance experience that would have helped him navigate the political landscape of a modernizing world. Unlike rulers of Britain or Germany, who were trained in statecraft from a young age, Nicholas was kept at a distance from governmental affairs. His father distrusted modern reforms and saw no need to involve his son in administration. As a result, Nicholas stepped into power without the essential tools needed to rule. Tragedy struck in 1894 when Alexander III fell gravely ill. His sudden decline shocked the Romanov family, as the once unshakable Tsar weakened rapidly. Nicholas, who had lived under his father's dominance, was unprepared for what came next. On his deathbed, Alexander III reportedly told his son to uphold the autocracy at all costs, a command that would shape Nicholas's rule in the years to come. When the Tsar passed away, Russia was left in the hands of a 26-year-old man who privately admitted, "I am not ready to be Tsar. I have never even been taught how to rule." His confession foreshadowed the uncertainty that would plague his reign. Adding to this fragile start was Nicholas's deep devotion to Alexandra of Hesse, the German princess he had long wished to marry. Their love was undeniable, but it was not welcomed by all. Alexandra was the granddaughter of Britain's Queen Victoria and had strong ties to Germany, making her an unpopular choice in Russia's political circles. Many feared her influence over Nicholas, viewing her as too rigid, too pious, and too foreign to understand Russia's needs. Her strong-willed nature clashed with Nicholas's reluctance, setting the stage for a dynamic where she would often push him toward decisions he might not have made alone. Their marriage took place just weeks after his father's death, adding to the unease surrounding the young Tsar's uncertain beginning. From the outset, Nicholas's leadership raised doubts. His coronation in 1896 was meant to be a grand affirmation of his rule, but it was overshadowed by disaster. The Kodinka tragedy, a stampede that killed thousands of people during a celebration for his coronation, was seen as a dark omen. Instead of grieving with the people, Nicholas attended a ball that same night, appearing detached from the suffering of his subjects. This moment would foreshadow the growing disconnect between the Tsar and his people. Russian officials and noble families whispered concerns. Was he too soft? Too indecisive? Did he truly understand the weight of the crown? Unlike his father, who commanded fear and respect, Nicholas was viewed as weak-willed, too reliant on those around him to make difficult choices. Beyond the walls of the Winter Palace, Russia was changing. The Industrial Revolution was sweeping through Europe, but Russia lagged behind, weighed down by an outdated social structure and growing economic disparity. Calls for reform were increasing, and unrest was beginning to simmer. The empire demanded a strong leader, one who could balance tradition with modernization, authority with reform. But as Nicholas stepped into power, his inexperience and rigid belief in autocracy set the stage for a reign that would be defined by struggle, resistance, and ultimately, the collapse of the Romanov dynasty. His rule had begun, but the fate of Russia was already shifting. Part 2. The Weight of the Crown. Struggles of an Autocratic Ruler. Nicholas II ruled with absolute power, yet his reign was plagued by uncertainty and detachment from the rapidly changing world around him. Unlike his father, who commanded authority through sheer force of will, Nicholas clung to the belief that his right to rule was unquestionable, ordained by God and bound by centuries of Romanov tradition. His faith in autocracy was unshakable, but it blinded him to the deep fractures forming within Russian society. While the rest of Europe moved toward constitutional monarchies and democratic reforms, Nicholas saw any shift away from autocratic rule as a betrayal of his sacred duty. He dismissed political reformers as troublemakers and refused to acknowledge that the empire was slipping into crisis. Surrounded by advisors who reinforced his conservative views, Nicholas remained resistant to change. Key ministers, such as Konstantin Pobedonostsev, his former tutor and a staunch defender of absolutism, instilled in him a deep suspicion of democracy and modernization. Figures like Interior Minister Vyacheslav von Plehve encouraged repressive policies, urging Nicholas to crush opposition rather than negotiate with it. Instead of adapting to the growing demands for reform, the Tsar relied on force to suppress dissent, believing that unrest could be silenced through control rather than compromise. However, the empire was evolving faster than Nicholas realized. Industrialization had brought millions of peasants into cities, creating a restless working class struggling with poor wages and harsh conditions. Discontent was no longer limited to intellectual circles. It was spilling into the streets. Despite the storm brewing outside the palace walls, Nicholas remained deeply devoted to his family and court traditions, often retreating into the comforts of his private life. While he cherished his role as a husband and father, this personal focus distanced him from the political realities of his empire. Many ministers found him difficult to approach, as he preferred to avoid confrontation rather than make decisive choices. This reluctance to engage with Russia's challenges led to growing instability, as those who sought reform found themselves ignored or dismissed. Even ministers who recognized the need for change, such as Sergei Witt, struggled to push Nicholas toward meaningful action. Witt, an advocate for industrial expansion and economic reform, urged the Tsar to modernize governance alongside economic growth. But Nicholas, distrustful of anything that threatened his absolute authority, kept Witt at arm's length and refused to grant meaningful concessions. Amid this political uncertainty, Alexandra's influence over Nicholas grew stronger. Deeply religious and unwavering in her belief in his divine right to rule, she encouraged him to stand firm against opposition. She viewed calls for reform as dangerous distractions and believed that Nicholas was chosen by God to lead Russia without interference. Her distrust of democracy reinforced Nicholas's own hesitations, leading him to reject even mild political adjustments that could have eased tensions. The couple's increasing reliance on mysticism, particularly through figures like Rasputin, would later deepen the rift between the monarchy and the people. As worker strikes and protests spread, Nicholas dismissed them as minor disturbances rather than warning signs of greater instability. He viewed revolutionaries as a radical minority rather than a reflection of growing dissatisfaction across all levels of society. Letters between Nicholas and Alexandra reveal their shared belief that the unrest was exaggerated and that firm leadership would restore order. However, this detachment from reality only fueled further resentment. Calls for democracy were no longer just theoretical discussions among intellectuals. They were now rallying cries in the streets of St. Petersburg and beyond. The empire stood on the brink of turmoil, yet Nicholas refused to see the warning signs. His belief in absolute rule remained unshaken, but cracks had already begun to form in the foundation of the Russian Empire. The question was no longer whether change was coming, but how violently it would arrive. Part 3. Blood on the Streets. The 1905 revolution ignites a nation. The Russian Empire in the early 20th century was a nation simmering with discontent. The economy was in turmoil, and industrialization had done little to improve the lives of the working class. Factories were overcrowded, wages remained stagnant, and workers toiled under unbearable conditions with no legal protections. In the countryside, peasants were burdened by land shortages and heavy taxes, while the nobility continued to hoard wealth. Dissatisfaction ran deep, but for many, there was still hope in the Tsar, a belief that their little father would listen to their suffering. That belief would soon be shattered forever. On January 22, 1905, thousands of workers, accompanied by their families, marched towards the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. The peaceful demonstration, led by the charismatic Orthodox priest Georgy Gapon, carried religious icons, portraits of Nicholas II, and a petition calling for better wages, fairer working hours, and the right to free speech. It was not a rebellion, it was a plea. But Nicholas II was not there to hear it. Instead, the Imperial Guard, fearing insurrection, stood waiting with their rifles. Moments later, the first shots were fired. What followed was massacre. As volleys of bullets tore through the unarmed crowd, men, women, and children collapsed onto the bloodied snow. Some attempted to flee, but they were cut down by gunfire or trampled in the chaos. The streets, once filled with hopeful voices, were now filled with screams. Estimates vary, but hundreds lay dead or wounded by the time the gunfire ceased. The people had come to beg their Tsar for justice, but instead, they were met with cold steel and lead. This day would be remembered as Bloody Sunday. The aftermath was immediate and explosive. Across Russia, fury ignited like wildfire. Workers launched massive strikes, paralyzing factories, railways, and entire industries. Universities became hubs of revolutionary thought as students protested en masse. In the countryside, angry peasants burned noble estates and seized land, taking justice into their own hands. Even within the military, discontent grew, the most infamous act of defiance coming from the battleship Potemkin mutiny, where sailors revolted against their officers and took control of the ship. The empire was on the brink of collapse. Nicholas II's reaction only deepened public resentment. Rather than addressing the suffering of his people, he dismissed the demonstrators as troublemakers and revolutionaries. His personal diary entry on the day of the massacre showed his detachment. A terrible day, but disturbances were bound to happen. While the empire burned, its ruler remained indifferent. Political groups seized the moment. The Bolsheviks, Mensheviks, and socialist revolutionaries gained rapid support, fueling the flames of rebellion. Calls for an end to autocratic rule grew louder, and even members of the aristocracy began questioning the monarchy's future. Meanwhile, foreign newspapers condemned Nicholas as a butcher, and the world watched as his empire unraveled. Although the Tsar managed to retain power for the moment, 1905 had exposed the cracks in his rule. It was a warning, a glimpse into the greater revolutions that lay ahead. The monarchy had drawn first blood, but the people would not forget. Nicholas believed he could suppress unrest with force, but the truth was undeniable. The Russian Empire would never be the same again. The countdown to its final collapse had begun. Part 4. A Fragile Promise. The Duma and a Doomed Attempt at Reform. The 1905 revolution had shaken the Russian Empire to its core. The workers had gone on strike, the peasants had rioted, and even the military had begun to waver. Nicholas II stood at a crossroads. He could either reform or risk complete upheaval. The October Manifesto, issued under pressure, promised civil liberties and a legislative body, the Duma. To the people, it seemed like a step toward democracy. To Nicholas, it was merely a temporary concession, a tool to pacify dissent while preserving his autocratic rule. At first, there was hope. The first Duma, assembled in 1906, was filled with liberals, reformists, and revolutionaries eager to reshape the empire. They demanded land redistribution, limits on the Tsar's power, and greater rights for workers. But Nicholas II had no intention of listening. He viewed the Duma not as a governing body, but as an annoyance, a group of upstarts daring to challenge his divine authority. When their proposals threatened his control, he dissolved the Duma within 10 weeks. The message was clear: the monarchy would not surrender power. Anger spread, but Nicholas remained firm. He appointed Pyotr Stolypin, a hardline conservative, as prime minister to restore order. Stolypin introduced harsh repressive measures, using military courts to execute thousands of suspected revolutionaries. The noose became so common that it was nicknamed Stolypin's necktie. At the same time, Stolypin pushed reforms to appease the peasants, allowing them to buy land and break away from communal farming. For a moment, it seemed like stability might return. But any progress was built on shaky ground. The Second Duma, elected in 1907, was even more radical than the first. The Tsar, unwilling to tolerate opposition, disbanded it again. He changed election laws to ensure only nobles, landowners, and Tsarist loyalists could dominate the next Duma. The third and fourth Dumas were docile, serving as rubber stamps for imperial policies. The illusion of reform was maintained, but the people had lost faith. Nicholas had granted democracy with one hand and crushed it with the other. As dissatisfaction festered, assassinations and unrest continued. Stolypin himself was gunned down in 1911, eliminating the one statesman who had managed to balance reform with repression. The Tsar, increasingly isolated, retreated further into his royal bubble. His court was dominated by reactionaries. His advisors warned him against making further concessions, and his belief in absolute monarchy remained unshaken. But the empire was far from stable. The peasants still suffered, workers still demanded rights, and revolutionary groups had gone underground, waiting for the right moment to strike. The Duma had been a false promise, a fragile attempt to stop a revolution that had already taken root. Nicholas believed he had restored order, but in reality, he had only delayed the inevitable. The people had not forgotten Bloody Sunday. The monarchy's betrayal had only deepened their resolve. The storm had not passed. It was merely gathering strength. With political dissatisfaction boiling beneath the surface, Russia would soon face a far greater test. As Nicholas ignored the warnings, a more devastating crisis loomed on the horizon. His next great mistake would come on the battlefields of World War I. Part 5. The Shadow of Rasputin. Influence, Scandal, and Royal Turmoil. As Nicholas II struggled to control the empire, another figure rose in influence within the royal court. A peasant-born mystic, Grigory Rasputin, would soon become one of the most controversial and divisive figures in Russian history. His presence would corrode the monarchy's reputation, fueling rumors, scandals, and deepening the public's resentment toward the imperial family. Rasputin first entered the Romanov circle in 1905, introduced as a holy man with miraculous abilities. His rise to power was tied to a secret that could never be revealed to the Russian people: the hemophilia of the Tsarevich Alexei, the heir to the throne. The young boy's condition was a death sentence in waiting, a fact that haunted Tsarina Alexandra. Desperate for a cure, she became enthralled by Rasputin, believing his prayers could heal Alexei when even the best doctors had failed. To the royal couple, he was a savior. To the Russian nobility, he was a dangerous fraud. To the people, he became the symbol of corruption eating away at the empire. As Rasputin's influence grew, so did the rumors. He was said to have hypnotic powers, prophetic visions, and an almost supernatural ability to manipulate those around him. He advised Alexandra on state matters, convinced her that only his guidance could protect Russia, and encouraged her deep distrust of government ministers. The Tsarina, already unpopular due to her German heritage, now appeared completely under his control. Worse still, Nicholas, who spent much of his time at military headquarters, left Alexandra to oversee domestic affairs, giving Rasputin an unchecked role in shaping policy. As ministers came and went dismissed at Rasputin's whim, Russia's political system fell into chaos. Those who opposed him, high-ranking officials, nobles, and even clergy members, warned Nicholas that Rasputin was a disaster waiting to happen. But Nicholas, blindly loyal to his wife, refused to act. The more criticism Rasputin attracted, the stronger Alexandra's defense of him became. The empire was being governed from behind a curtain of mysticism, paranoia, and secrecy. As Rasputin's reputation plunged into scandal, so did the monarchies. He was accused of drunken debauchery, womanizing, and political manipulation. Satirical cartoons depicted him as the real ruler of Russia, while newspapers printed salacious tales of his late-night escapades. His connection to Alexandra and the Romanov daughters sparked vile gossip, fueling the belief that the imperial family had lost all moral standing. To the suffering people, who endured food shortages, war, and government incompetence, Rasputin was the face of everything wrong with the monarchy. The tension reached a breaking point. In December 1916, a group of aristocrats, led by Prince Felix Yusupov and Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, plotted to eliminate Rasputin once and for all. What followed was one of history's most infamous assassinations. Rasputin was poisoned, shot multiple times, and ultimately drowned in the freezing Neva River. His death was meant to save the monarchy, but it was too late. The damage was irreversible. The Russian people, who once feared Rasputin's influence, now saw his murder as a desperate attempt to salvage a doomed regime. The monarchy's credibility had been shattered, and Nicholas remained as detached as ever. With Rasputin gone, the empire still faced its greatest threat yet. A full-scale revolution was brewing. As Russia marched deeper into the chaos of war and starvation, the storm of revolution could no longer be ignored. Soon, the Romanovs would face their greatest reckoning. The empire was beginning to collapse from within. Part 6, A War Too Great, Russia's Costly Gamble in World War I. Nicholas II believed war would be his salvation, a unifying force that would silence his critics and reignite loyalty to the throne. In 1914, when Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, Russia mobilized in defense of its Slavic ally, believing it could emerge victorious. The Tsar, eager to prove Russia's strength, saw the conflict as an opportunity to restore national pride and secure his place in history. However, the reality of war quickly shattered these illusions. Russia was stepping onto the battlefield not as an invincible empire, but as a nation already cracking under pressure. The Russian military was woefully unprepared for the scale of the conflict. Despite having one of the largest armies in the world, it was poorly trained, under-equipped, and plagued by outdated tactics. Logistics were chaotic, troops lacked rifles, ammunition, and even boots. Many soldiers were sent into battle with orders to retrieve weapons from fallen comrades, an appalling sign of the empire's disorganization. The situation worsened with the disastrous Battle of Tannenberg in August 1914, where Russian forces, suffering from poor coordination and a lack of intelligence, were encircled and annihilated by the Germans. Over 170,000 Russian soldiers were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner, and an entire army corps was wiped out. It was a humiliating defeat that sent shockwaves through the empire, revealing Russia's military weakness to both its enemies and its own people. Determined to turn the tide, Nicholas II made a fateful decision in September 1915. He assumed personal command of the Russian army. His advisors, including seasoned military leaders, strongly opposed this move, warning that the Tsar lacked the strategic knowledge and adaptability required to lead an army in modern warfare. But Nicholas, convinced that it was his divine duty to lead, dismissed their concerns. With this decision, he directly tied his reputation to the success or failure of the war. Every defeat, every setback would now bear his name. While Nicholas focused on the front, he left the governance of Russia in the hands of his wife, Empress Alexandra. Isolated in the royal palaces, she relied heavily on the controversial mystic Grigory Rasputin, whose influence over her deepened public resentment. Ministers were dismissed at Rasputin's whim, policies became erratic, and the empire was increasingly viewed as being ruled by a corrupt and incompetent inner circle. Trust in the monarchy eroded further as rumors swirled of Rasputin's unchecked power over the royal family. Meanwhile, the war effort drained Russia's already fragile economy. Military spending skyrocketed, forcing the government to print money, leading to rampant inflation. By 1916, essential goods became unaffordable for the average citizen. Food shortages in the cities worsened as transport systems collapsed, and long breadlines became a symbol of the people's suffering. Factory workers, struggling to survive on meager wages, went on strike, further crippling the war economy. On the battlefield, Russian soldiers faced unbearable conditions: freezing temperatures, inadequate supplies, and waves of brutal combat against a better-equipped German army. Reports of mass desertion surfaced, as entire regiments abandoned their posts, unwilling to fight for a cause they no longer believed in. Despite these clear signs of collapse, Nicholas refused to withdraw from the war. He was pressured by Britain and France to keep fighting, but they offered little in terms of meaningful support. The empire was bleeding from within, and the cracks were no longer hidden. By early 1917, the situation was beyond repair. Hunger riots, strikes, and military mutinies swept through the country like wildfire. The people had lost faith in their ruler, the soldiers had lost the will to fight, and the monarchy stood on the edge of a precipice. Nicholas's unwavering belief in his divine right to rule had blinded him to the storm that was now impossible to stop. The empire was slipping from his grasp, and soon, it would be taken from him entirely. Part 7. Crumbling from Within. Famine, strikes, and rising unrest. The Russian Empire stood on the brink of collapse, its once mighty foundation rotting beneath the weight of war, famine, and growing discontent. The streets of Petrograd and Moscow were filled with restless, hungry citizens, their faces gaunt with suffering. Inflation had spiraled out of control as the government desperately printed more money to finance its failing war effort, rendering wages worthless, while the price of bread soared beyond the reach of ordinary families. Hunger gnawed at the bellies of the poor, and even the middle class found themselves unable to afford basic necessities. As winter set in, the situation became even more dire. Food supplies, already scarce, dwindled to dangerous levels as transportation networks broke down, leaving entire cities starving. Long lines formed outside bakeries at dawn, desperate mothers clutching their children as they shivered in the cold, waiting for rations that often never arrived. The railways, overburdened by the demands of war, failed to deliver grain from the countryside, and what little made it to the cities was hoarded by profiteers or redirected to feed the army. Starvation spread like a plague, turning anger toward the government into outright fury. In factories, the desperation was just as severe. Workers, already subjected to grueling conditions, saw their wages rendered meaningless by inflation. They toiled endlessly in freezing, poorly lit workshops, producing weapons and goods for a war that felt increasingly futile. Strikes erupted across industrial centers as frustration boiled over, and by late 1916, entire workforces walked off their jobs. The once loyal labor class, on which the empire relied, now turned its back on Nicholas II. Their chants echoed through the streets, calling for bread, peace, and change. While the cities seethed with unrest, the morale of Russia's vast army crumbled. Soldiers, many of whom came from the same starving villages as the striking workers, were exhausted, disillusioned, and barely clothed against the brutal winter. Desertion soared as entire units abandoned their posts, unwilling to die for a war that no longer made sense. Some defected to radical revolutionary groups, carrying with them the weapons and discipline of trained fighters. For the first time, the Tsar's own military was beginning to slip from his grasp. Despite the growing chaos, Nicholas II refused to acknowledge the severity of the crisis. Isolated in his palace and increasingly detached from the struggles of his people, he dismissed reports of mass protests and strikes as minor disturbances, insisting that the empire would persevere. His ministers, fearing his wrath, withheld the worst details from him, creating a dangerous illusion of stability. The Tsar's misplaced confidence only deepened the people's resentment, making him appear out of touch and indifferent to their suffering. Meanwhile, radical voices gained momentum. The Bolsheviks and other socialist factions, once considered fringe movements, found fertile ground in the desperation of workers and soldiers. They promised an end to hunger, an end to war, and an end to autocracy. Pamphlets spread through the cities like wildfire, urging rebellion, calling for revolution. The empire teetered on the edge of an abyss, and in December 1916, the assassination of Rasputin, a figure long despised for his influence over the royal family, was supposed to be a turning point. Yet instead of restoring faith in the monarchy, his death did nothing to stop the rising tide of anger. The empire was crumbling from within, its people starving, its army disintegrating, and its ruler blind to the storm gathering around him. It was only a matter of time before the breaking point arrived. And it would come sooner than Nicholas could ever imagine. Part 8. The February Revolution. The throne slips away. The bitter winter of 1917 found Russia teetering on the edge of collapse. Hunger and exhaustion gripped the cities as food shortages worsened. The war had drained the empire of resources, leaving the working class and soldiers on the brink of despair. Factories shut down as strikes spread like wildfire, while soldiers returning from the front brought with them anger and disillusionment. The nation stood at a breaking point, but no one, not even the Tsar, realized how close the empire was to imploding. On February 23, 1917, what began as a small demonstration on International Women's Day turned into the moment that would ignite the revolution. Women took to the streets of Petrograd demanding bread, chanting for relief from their endless suffering. Factory workers quickly joined, swelling the crowd into thousands. Within hours, protests erupted across the city, factories shut down, and the streets became a battleground of rage and desperation. The city police, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of unrest, struggled to maintain control. The Tsar, still stationed at Mogilev headquarters on the war front, received early reports but dismissed the protests as minor disturbances. He failed to grasp the gravity of the situation, believing his people would soon be pacified. But Petrograd was no longer under his rule. The anger that had simmered for years had now erupted into full-scale rebellion. As days passed, the crisis deepened. On February 26, Nicholas ordered the military to suppress the protests by any means necessary. But when the troops opened fire, some regiments mutinied instead. Entire battalions began refusing orders, defecting to the revolutionaries, and handing over their weapons to the masses. By the next day, most of the Petrograd garrison had turned against the Tsar, marking the moment when his grip on power truly faltered. By now, Nicholas realized the situation was spiraling beyond his control. He prepared to return to Petrograd, but it was already too late. Key railway lines had been seized by revolutionaries, cutting him off from the capital. With no direct path back, he was forced to remain isolated, powerless to intervene as the government crumbled before him. On March 1, 1917, the Duma, sensing its opportunity, declared itself the provisional government, with Prince Lvov at its head. In that instant, Nicholas was no longer the ruler of Russia in anything but name. Even his most loyal military leaders, fearing total anarchy, advised him that the only way to prevent civil war was to abdicate. For Nicholas, the weight of failure now pressed upon him in full force. The empire, built over centuries, was collapsing in a matter of days. His throne was slipping away, and for the first time, he had no power to stop it. Part 9, The Abdication, Nicholas II's last act as Tsar. The walls of the empire were closing in, yet Nicholas II remained oblivious to just how little control he had left. The February Revolution had swept through Petrograd, forcing the Tsar to cut short his journey back from the war front. But when his train reached Pskov, it could go no further. The rail lines ahead were blocked, controlled by revolutionaries who had risen against him. His once loyal generals and ministers now spoke in hushed, urgent tones, warning him that the empire was unraveling at an unstoppable pace. At first, Nicholas refused to accept the possibility of abdication. He saw himself as the rightful ruler, appointed by God, and to relinquish the throne would be to betray Russia itself. But the reality was stark. His army no longer stood behind him, the people had turned against him, and his own advisors were urging him to step aside. Even his most trusted military commanders, including General Alexeyev, pressed him to accept that his rule was over. They feared that if he refused, civil war would engulf the nation, tearing it apart from within. Struggling to make sense of the moment, Nicholas considered passing the crown to his young son, Alexei. But the boy was sickly, his hemophilia a constant threat to his life. Nicholas could not bear the thought of his fragile child being thrust into power amidst such chaos. Instead, he turned to his brother, Grand Duke Michael, offering him the throne in hopes of preserving the Romanov dynasty. The decision was made on March 2, 1917. Nicholas picked up his pen and signed the formal abdication document, surrendering the crown that had defined his life. The moment was profound. 3 centuries of Romanov rule crumbled with the stroke of a pen. For the first time in over 300 years, Russia had no Tsar. Word spread like wildfire. In Petrograd, crowds erupted into celebrations, tearing down imperial symbols and rejoicing in what they believed was the birth of a new free Russia. But in other parts of the country, uncertainty loomed. What would come next? Who would lead the empire now that the autocrat had fallen? As Nicholas stepped away from his throne, he appeared calm, almost detached. His belief in divine monarchy was so deeply ingrained that he could not fully grasp that his dynasty had fallen. He convinced himself that the country would soon stabilize under the new provisional government, and he and his family would live quietly in exile. But he had underestimated the storm that was about to follow. The very forces that had demanded his abdication would soon turn against him completely. On March 3, Grand Duke Michael, sensing the rising unrest and fearing for his own life, refused the throne. He declared that he would only rule if the Russian people formally asked him to. But such an appeal never came. With that decision, the Russian monarchy, one of the most powerful and enduring in history, ceased to exist. The Romanovs were no longer rulers, they were prisoners of fate. Nicholas and his family were placed under house arrest by the provisional government. Stripped of his imperial title, he was now simply Nikolai Alexandrovich Romanov. He was no longer a Tsar, no longer an emperor, no longer the autocrat of all Russia. The world he had known had vanished overnight. But this was only the beginning of his descent. Darker days lay ahead, far darker than he could have ever imagined. Part 10, House Arrest, the Romanovs in captivity. The once mighty ruler of Russia now found himself a prisoner in his own land. Nicholas II, the man who had commanded an empire, had been stripped of his title, his power, and his purpose. After his abdication, he and his family were placed under house arrest at the Alexander Palace, a place that had once symbolized their imperial grandeur, but now became a gilded cage. The provisional government, unsure of what to do with them, treated them not as royalty but as detainees, keeping them under strict watch. At first, the transition felt surreal to the Romanovs. The opulence of their past still surrounded them, yet their world had changed overnight. Guards patrolled the halls, restricting their movement and monitoring their conversations. Communications with the outside world were heavily censored, and even their loyal servants were dismissed. The children, who had once played freely in palace gardens, were confined indoors, their laughter stifled by the reality of their imprisonment. Nicholas, still adjusting to life without power, found solace in simple routines. He chopped wood, read books, and spent time with his children, clinging to normalcy in an abnormal situation. Alexandra, deeply shaken by their circumstances, remained withdrawn, leaning on her unwavering faith. She convinced herself that their suffering was a test from God, that deliverance would come. Letters between the former Tsarina and her allies revealed her enduring belief that foreign intervention, perhaps from their British relatives, would save them. But unknown to her, the tides of history were turning against them. The Russian people, once conditioned to revere the Romanovs as divine rulers, were now divided. Some still saw Nicholas as their rightful leader, but many viewed him as a failed autocrat who had led Russia into ruin. His public image had shattered. Where once there had been portraits of the Tsar in homes across the empire, now there were angry calls for justice. The provisional government hesitated, unsure whether exile, imprisonment, or trial would be the best course of action. Meanwhile, the Bolsheviks, growing in power, saw the Romanovs as a lingering symbol of the old regime, one that could not be allowed to survive. By August 1917, the government, fearing unrest in Petrograd, ordered the Romanovs to be moved. Their destination, Tobolsk, a remote Siberian town where the climate was harsh and isolation would be complete. The journey was grueling. Guarded by armed soldiers, the family endured the trip in silence, their uncertain future weighing heavily upon them. When they arrived, it was clear that they were no longer under mere house arrest. They were exiles, cut off from the world they had once ruled. Despite the bleakness of their situation, Nicholas and Alexandra clung to hope. They believed that exile was temporary, that their family would be sent abroad to live in quiet seclusion. But the Russia they had known was gone. The provisional government was crumbling, and in the shadows the Bolsheviks were waiting. For the Romanovs, the walls were closing in. Part 11, A Nation in Flames, the Russian Civil War begins. The Russian Civil War erupted in the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution, throwing the country into one of the deadliest internal conflicts in history. The fall of the provisional government in October 1917 had left Russia without a stable leadership, and the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, sought to consolidate their grip on power. However, not everyone accepted Soviet rule, and within months, battle lines were drawn between the Red Army, fiercely defending communist ideals, and the White Army, an anti-Bolshevik coalition determined to reverse the revolution. This war was not simply a military confrontation, it was an existential struggle for the future of Russia. The Whites included royalists, former Tsarist generals, moderate liberals, and socialists opposed to Bolshevik dictatorship. Meanwhile, the Reds, under the leadership of Lenin and Trotsky, viewed the war as a final battle against counter-revolutionary forces that sought to restore the past. The conflict quickly escalated into a brutal nationwide struggle, with cities, villages, and entire regions becoming battlegrounds. The Bolsheviks had one distinct advantage: control over Russia's industrial and population centers, including Petrograd and Moscow. This allowed them to organize and supply their forces more effectively, while the Whites remained divided, operating from scattered strongholds across Siberia, the south, and parts of Ukraine. Despite their superior resources, the Bolsheviks faced numerous threats from internal uprisings, foreign interventions, and even former allies turning against them. The Russian people, already suffering from years of war and famine, found themselves caught in another cycle of devastation, with starvation, disease, and mass executions becoming an everyday reality. Foreign powers also entered the fray, fearing the spread of communism across Europe. Britain, France, the United States, and Japan all sent military aid to the White Army, believing that the downfall of the Bolsheviks would prevent revolutions elsewhere. However, these interventions proved largely ineffective. The Whites were deeply divided, plagued by conflicting ideologies, lack of coordination, and corruption within their ranks. In contrast, the Red Army, under Trotsky's leadership, became a highly disciplined and ruthless force, using propaganda, terror, and strict military control to maintain dominance. As the war intensified, the fate of Nicholas II and his family became a major concern. To the Whites, the Romanovs were a symbol of legitimacy, a rallying point that could unite their fragmented factions. To the Bolsheviks, however, the former Tsar represented a dangerous figurehead whose survival could be exploited by counter-revolutionaries. Lenin and his government recognized that as long as the Romanovs lived, they remained a threat to the revolution. By 1919, the tide of war turned overwhelmingly in favor of the Bolsheviks. The White Army suffered catastrophic defeats on multiple fronts, forcing them into retreat. Thousands of white officers and their supporters fled the country, seeking asylum in Europe and Asia. Meanwhile, the Red Army tightened its grip, crushing opposition with unparalleled brutality. The war would continue for several more years, but by this point, the Bolsheviks had already ensured their eventual victory. The war had sealed the Romanovs' fate. Any hopes of rescue had vanished as the White Army struggled to maintain ground. With Bolshevik power now nearly absolute, Lenin and his inner circle knew that leaving the Tsar alive was too great a risk. The flames of war consumed Russia, but amid this national devastation, the fate of the imperial family would soon reach its tragic conclusion. Part 12. The Last Days in Ekaterinburg, A Family's Final Hours. The Romanovs arrived in Ekaterinburg on a cold April day in 1918, their once glorious status now reduced to mere prisoners of the Bolshevik regime. The House of Special Purpose, as the Uphold house was called, became their final residence, surrounded by towering wooden fences and heavily armed guards. Their new reality was grim: no visitors, no newspapers, and no connection to the outside world. The once mighty Tsar Nicholas II and his family were now at the mercy of their captors, their fate hanging in the balance as revolution tore through Russia. Life inside the Uphold house was bleak. Food was scarce, and the guards' treatment became increasingly harsh. At first, they followed orders with rigid discipline, but soon the hostility grew. The guards mocked the imperial family, stole their belongings, and imposed humiliating restrictions. Nicholas and Alexandra endured it with silent dignity, but their children, especially Anastasia, struggled with the confinement. Alexei, the sickly heir, suffered the most, his hemophilia worsening under the stressful conditions. Alexandra turned to prayer, filling her diary with religious musings and unwavering faith that a divine rescue was near. The Grand Duchesses, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, clung to a fragile hope that they would soon be exiled rather than executed. Beyond the walls of the Uphold house, the fate of the Romanovs was being debated. Some Bolsheviks, particularly in Moscow, wanted a formal trial, a public reckoning for the monarchy's failures. But Lenin and his inner circle feared that the Romanovs could become a rallying point for monarchists and foreign governments. The White Army, loyal to the Tsar, was advancing towards Ekaterinburg, adding urgency to the Bolsheviks' deliberations. Time was running out. By mid-July, the tension inside the house reached a breaking point. The guards grew more agitated, their movements suspicious. Alexandra noted in her diary that the atmosphere had shifted. Something was coming. On the night of July 16th, Yakov Yurovsky, the commandant of the house, received his final orders from Moscow. The Romanovs were to be executed before the White Army could reach them. Yurovsky handpicked a team of executioners, ensuring their absolute loyalty. There would be no mistakes. That evening, Carts were seen arriving and departing from the Ipatov house. Supplies were moved, documents destroyed, and preparations finalized. Meanwhile, inside, the Romanovs followed their usual routine, unaware that their final hours were slipping away. Alexandra tended to Alexei, the Grand Duchesses whispered among themselves, and Nicholas, ever the father figure, tried to maintain a sense of calm. The irony was cruel. Having survived the storms of revolution, war, and exile, they believed they had endured the worst. But history had already sealed their fate. The night stretched on, silent and foreboding. As the clock neared midnight, the Romanovs lay in their cramped quarters, their imperial past reduced to nothing but fading memories. The end was near, and the world outside had already moved on. Part 13. The Execution, the End of the Romanovs. In the dead of night on July 17, 1918, the Romanov family was roused from sleep in the Ipatov house, their final prison in Ekaterinburg. Guards informed them that due to unrest in the city and the approaching White Army, they were to be moved to a safer location. Believing they were being transported elsewhere, Nicholas, Alexandra, their 5 children, and their attendants hurriedly dressed and descended the narrow staircase into the basement chamber. The Tsar, still holding on to dignity, carried his sickly son Alexei, whose hemophilia had left him too weak to stand for long periods. Alexandra and Alexei were provided chairs while the rest of the family stood against the wall. The room was suffocatingly small, its whitewashed walls barely able to contain the doomed prisoners and their executioners. At precisely 2:30 a.m., Yakov Yurovsky, the Bolshevik commandant overseeing the Romanovs, entered with a squad of armed men. He coldly read aloud the decree of execution, stating that the Ural Soviet had sentenced Nicholas to death. Confusion flickered across the former Tsar's face, as he barely had time to process the words before Yurovsky lifted his pistol and fired the first shot into his chest. Nicholas collapsed instantly, blood pooling beneath him, his final words lost in the chaos. Gunfire erupted in the small chamber, filling it with smoke and deafening noise as bullets flew indiscriminately. Alexandra, Anna Demidova, her maid, and the 4 daughters screamed as shots ricocheted off the walls. The executioners, disorganized and nervous, fired wildly in all directions, many missing their targets in the confusion. When the smoke cleared, some of the family still stirred. The jewels sewn into the daughters' corsets had absorbed much of the gunfire, acting as makeshift armor that prolonged their suffering. Realizing the mistake, the executioners resorted to bayonets and close-range shots to finish the grim task. Maria and Anastasia, still alive and sobbing, clung to each other as they were repeatedly stabbed and shot. Alexei, too weak to move, lay trembling in a pool of blood until Yurovsky fired 2 final bullets into his head. The scene was a massacre, walls splattered with blood, the floor covered in lifeless bodies, and the acrid stench of gunpowder lingering in the air. After confirming that no one remained alive, the executioners hastily removed valuables from the bodies. They stripped the corpses of jewelry, looting rings, brooches, and necklaces before dragging the bodies out of the house and loading them onto waiting trucks. Under cover of darkness, the convoy moved toward the dense forest outside Ekaterinburg, where the remains would be disposed of in secret. Initially, the executioners attempted to burn and destroy the bodies with acid, hoping to erase any trace of the Romanovs. When this proved insufficient, they buried them in a hastily dug grave, but paranoia forced them to relocate the remains again. In their desperation, the Bolsheviks hacked the corpses into pieces and threw some into an abandoned mineshaft, while others were buried nearby. Acid was poured over the bodies to prevent recognition, and the grave was concealed under railway ties. The Bolsheviks publicly announced Nicholas's execution days later, but concealed the fate of the rest of the family. For years, rumors spread that one or more of the children had survived, fueling myths and conspiracy theories. It was not until decades later that forensic evidence confirmed the horrific truth. The entire Romanov family had been brutally wiped out that night in Ekaterinburg, Despite the Soviets' attempts to erase their legacy, the Romanovs would not be forgotten. Their deaths marked the definitive end of Russia's imperial era, paving the way for a new ruthless regime that would shape the course of the 20th century. Part 14. The Soviet Era, Erasing the Tsar's Legacy. With the execution of Nicholas II and his family, the Bolsheviks took decisive steps to cement their control over Russia. The fall of the Romanovs was not just political, it was symbolic. Lenin and his followers sought to dismantle every trace of the imperial past, ensuring that the monarchy would never return. The Soviet Union was built on the promise of a new future, and that required burying the past, both figuratively and literally. The destruction of imperial symbols began immediately. Palaces that once housed Russia's elite were repurposed for the state, their luxurious interiors stripped and defaced. Romanov estates were confiscated, with personal belongings either looted or placed in state museums as relics of a decadent past. Statues of the Tsars were torn down, replaced with monuments to Lenin and the revolutionaries who had overthrown them. The Bolsheviks wanted to make it clear, Russia would never look back. Nicholas II was systematically vilified in Soviet propaganda. He was portrayed as weak, foolish, and out of touch with the struggles of ordinary Russians. Soviet history books labeled him a tyrant whose incompetence had led to war, famine, and revolution. The suffering of the Russian people under his rule was emphasized, while any achievements of his reign were erased or downplayed. To justify their actions, the Bolsheviks claimed his execution was a necessary step to prevent counter-revolutionary forces from rallying around the monarchy. Censorship of Romanov history became standard practice. Any discussion of the imperial family was discouraged, and records were either altered or destroyed. Photographs of Nicholas II and his family disappeared from public view, and official narratives focused solely on the struggles of the proletariat against aristocratic oppression. Schools taught children that the revolution had saved Russia from disaster, reinforcing the belief that the monarchy had been nothing more than a cruel relic of the past. As the Soviet Union advanced under Lenin and later Stalin, history was rewritten to fit the communist narrative. The revolution was framed as inevitable, a moment of liberation for the people. The failures of Nicholas II were contrasted with the industrialization and modernization efforts of the Soviet government, reinforcing the idea that the country had only thrived after breaking free from its imperial chains. The Romanovs were relics of a bygone era, one that had no place in the workers' state. Meanwhile, the surviving members of the Romanov court faced persecution. Any remaining nobles were forced into exile, stripped of their wealth and titles. Those who remained in Russia lived in fear, many arrested and executed as enemies of the state. Even discussing the Romanovs became dangerous, as the Bolsheviks sought to ensure that no trace of their influence remained. Perhaps the greatest erasure of all was the mystery surrounding the Romanovs' remains. For decades, the Soviet government denied that Nicholas II and his family had been executed. Official reports claimed that only Nicholas had been killed, while his wife and children had been sent elsewhere. The truth remained hidden until 1979, when amateur historians discovered a shallow grave in Ekaterinburg. Yet, even then, the Soviet regime suppressed the findings, unwilling to acknowledge the full extent of its past actions. The Romanovs had vanished not just from life, but from history itself. And for much of the 20th century, the Soviet Union ensured that their memory remained buried. 15. Re-evaluating Nicholas II, martyr, tyrant, or tragic figure? More than a century after his death, Nicholas II remains one of history's most debated figures. Was he a tyrant whose failures doomed an empire, a martyr betrayed by his people, or a tragic ruler caught in the tide of revolution? His legacy has been examined, re-examined, and reconstructed, shaped by political shifts, historical discoveries, and changing public sentiment. For decades under Soviet rule, Nicholas II was painted as a weak, incompetent ruler whose arrogance and mismanagement had plunged Russia into chaos. Official narratives depicted him as indifferent to the suffering of his people, clinging to absolute power, while revolution brewed around him. His execution was framed as a necessary step to secure the revolution, preventing monarchist forces from using him as a symbol to rally against Bolshevik rule. In the Soviet Union, there was no room for nuance. Nicholas II was the past, and the past had to be erased. However, as time passed and Soviet censorship faded, new perspectives emerged. Some historians have argued that Nicholas was not the tyrant the Bolsheviks made him out to be, but rather a ruler bound by tradition, unable to adapt to the rapidly changing world around him. He was raised to believe in the divine right of kings, instilled with the conviction that his authority was sacred and unchallengeable. Yet he was not ruthless like Ivan the Terrible or strategic like Peter the Great. He was neither a visionary nor a reformer, just a man who believed he was doing his duty, even as his empire slipped from his grasp. The re-evaluation of Nicholas II's reign gained momentum after the fall of the Soviet Union. With the opening of archives and the rediscovery of the Romanov remains, the full extent of his downfall became clearer. Some began to see him as a tragic figure, a ruler who loved his family but failed his people, a man who desired stability but instead presided over catastrophe. His personal letters revealed a devoted husband and father, deeply concerned for his wife and children even as his empire crumbled. These humanizing details clashed with the Soviet portrayal of him as a cruel, detached autocrat. The Russian Orthodox Church canonized Nicholas II and his family in 2000, declaring them passion bearers, individuals who met their deaths with Christian humility. To some, this was an act of historical justice, recognizing the Romanovs not as political figures, but as innocent victims of Bolshevik brutality. Yet for others, it was an attempt to rewrite history, ignoring the failures and missteps that had led to revolution in the first place. The debate over Nicholas II's sainthood reflected the deeper divide over his legacy. Was he a holy martyr or merely an ill-fated monarch caught in a storm of his own making? Beyond Russia, Nicholas II's place in history remains equally complex. Western historians often depict him as a well-meaning but ineffective ruler, unable to grasp the scale of his nation's suffering. His fatal decision to enter World War I, his resistance to political reform, and his reliance on figures like Rasputin all contributed to the fall of the Romanovs. His reign was marked by disasters: Bloody Sunday, the 1905 Revolution, the brutal suppression of dissent, and the ultimate collapse of the Russian monarchy. Whether these failures were due to his own shortcomings or the circumstances of the time remains a point of contention. Today, Russia itself remains divided on Nicholas II. While some see him as a symbol of lost grandeur and Imperial Russia's golden age, others view him as the man who let the empire fall apart. His story is told in books, films, and documentaries, each offering a different interpretation of his rule and his downfall. His execution in 1918 marked the end of an era, but the questions surrounding his legacy remain alive, debated by historians and politicians alike. Was Nicholas II a victim of forces beyond his control? A leader too stubborn to change? A ruler too gentle for a harsh world? History continues to judge him, but the final verdict may never be settled. Thanks for tuning in to Historical Legacies. If you enjoyed this dive into history, please like, subscribe, and share. Join us next time for more fascinating stories from the past.